The 40th floor smelled like money and indifference. Sariel had learned to identify both by their specific properties. Money smelled like the particular combination of fresh paint, imported marble cleaner, and the faint trace of fragrances that cost more than her weekly take-home, fragrances that lingered in corridors hours after the people wearing them had gone. Indifference smelled like nothing at all, which was its own kind of smell, the complete and deliberate absence of acknowledgement that accumulated in spaces where the people who maintained them were considered a feature of the building rather than a presence inside it. She had been working the 40th floor for 7 months. She knew both smells intimately. Her cart came off the service elevator at 1:58, 2 minutes before her assigned start time, which was not a coincidence but a discipline. 2 minutes gave her enough time to orient herself in the corridor, confirm her supply levels, and begin without the particular breathlessness of someone who appears to be catching up. Appearing to be catching up attracted attention. Attention attracted questions. Questions in a building like this one had a way of producing consequences that a woman in her position could not afford. And so, she arrived at 1:58 every night without exception, and the discipline of it had become, over 7 months, as automatic as breathing. The 40th floor was the executive hospitality wing. It had 3 private event suites, a members-only lounge that Sariel had never seen occupied before midnight, and carpets that required working in a specific direction to restore their nap after the day staff had finished with them. It also had the private elevator, the brushed gold one on the east wall that Sariel had cleaned the exterior of every night for 7 months without ever seeing its doors open. She started at the south end as always and worked north. The scuff mark near the baseboard outside Suite 4 was new, left sometime during the evening's event, and she lowered herself to her knees to address it with the focused attention of someone who understands that this floor's surfaces are inspected at a standard that does not accommodate shortcuts. She worked at it with steady and unhurried pressure, and the corridor was quiet around her in the specific way that expensive buildings are quiet after midnight. Not empty exactly, but held, suspended in the particular stillness of spaces that are resting between performances. She was still on her knees when the private elevator opened. The sound was different from the service elevator, cleaner and more decisive, the sound of something that had never been designed to wait or apologize for its own existence. Sariel registered it without looking up, which was instinct and also protocol, and also the accumulated wisdom of 7 months of understanding that looking up uninvited in this building was the kind of small and readable gesture that could be misinterpreted by exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. She kept her eyes on the baseboard. She kept her hands moving. She heard the heels first, a sharp and unhesitating rhythm on marble that communicated, before anything else did, that the person producing the sound was accustomed to floors clearing ahead of her rather than requiring her to navigate around what was already on them. Then she heard the voice, clipped and dissatisfied and directed at a phone rather than at anything in the corridor, the voice of a woman mid-conversation about something that had not gone her way and had left her with a particular quality of irritation that she was carrying into the space around her the way weather carries itself, without asking permission and without concern for what it lands on. Sariel moved her cart to the left side of the corridor without standing. A small adjustment, a practiced one. The heels slowed almost imperceptibly as the woman passed her position, the slight hesitation of someone who has registered an obstacle and assessed it as beneath the level of attention it would cost to fully acknowledge it. Sariel felt the assessment without seeing it and said nothing, and kept her hands on the baseboard and her breathing even and her presence as unremarkable as the marble beneath her knees. The heels moved on. Sariel exhaled slowly. Then the cart shifted. Not dramatically, not with any violence, but with the quiet inevitability of an object struck by something moving through a space without full attention to what the space contained. The designer bag swung forward. The coffee cup tilted. The physics of it were simple and immediate and entirely without malice. But malice, Sariel had learned, was rarely the operating principle in moments like this one. The coffee hit the floor in a wide and darkening arc. The corridor went very still. Sariel looked at the spreading stain on the floor she had already cleaned twice that evening, and then looked up for the first time since the elevator had opened and found herself looking directly into the face of a woman who had already decided, in the 2 seconds since the spill, exactly whose fault this was. Vespera did not look at the coffee. She looked at Sariel, which was a different and more deliberate thing, the look of a woman who has located the source of her inconvenience and intends to make the distance between them felt. It was a practiced look, the kind that does not arrive fully formed but is refined over years of inhabiting spaces where it produces the desired result without requiring anything as effortful as an actual argument. It communicated, in the span of 3 seconds and without a single word, that what had just happened was Sariel's fault, that Sariel's fault was consistent with what Sariel was, and that what Sariel was did not merit the energy of elaboration. Then Vespera said it anyway. She said that people who left their things in the middle of corridors where guests were walking should not be surprised when those things caused problems. She said it with the flat and unhurried authority of someone delivering a self-evident truth to a slow audience. She said it while looking at her phone, which made it worse, the particular cruelty of being addressed by someone who does not consider you worth the full allocation of their attention while they are diminishing you. Sariel looked at her cart. It was against the left wall of the corridor, where she had moved it when she heard the elevator open, which was protocol and habit, and the specific defensive instinct of a woman who had learned to anticipate the space that other people required and provide it before being asked. The cart had not been in the middle of the corridor. This was a fact that existed independently of whether it would ever be acknowledged as one. She reached for her cloth and began addressing the spill. Vespera watched her for a moment with the expression of someone observing a task they find both necessary and vaguely distasteful. Then she looked at her shoes, the cream Italian ones that had absorbed the edge of the spill along the right toe, and the expression shifted into something sharper and more purposeful, the expression of a woman who has identified an additional grievance and is deciding what to do with it. She told Sariel the shoes needed attention. Sariel's hand slowed on the cloth without stopping. She did not look up. She understood with complete and immediate clarity what was being asked, what it would cost her to refuse, and what it would cost her to comply, and she held both costs simultaneously in the silence of the corridor, while the coffee continued spreading slowly across the marble, and Vespera waited with the patience of someone who has never once doubted that waiting would produce the result she intended. Sariel thought about Eli. She thought about the medication and the night shift, and the supervisor's words on her first day, about incidents involving guests and the particular arithmetic of a life, where every decision runs through the same calculation before it is made. She began to move toward the shoe. And Vespera smiled. The smile did not last long enough to be mistaken for warmth. It arrived and settled into something harder almost immediately. The smile of a woman who has confirmed a suspicion she held before entering the room and finds the confirmation satisfying in the specific way that people find satisfying the things that cost them nothing. Sariel was close enough now to see the detail of it, and she kept her eyes on the shoe and her hands steady, and her face arranged in the particular blankness that she had developed over 7 months as her primary professional tool. The expression that communicated neither submission nor resistance, that gave nothing away and invited nothing further, that was, in its own quiet way, the only armor she currently owned. She cleaned the shoe. It took less than 40 seconds. The mark was superficial, and the cloth she was using was the correct one for the material, and she worked with the efficient precision of someone whose hands know what they are doing even when the rest of her is occupied with something else entirely. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and returned to the spill on the floor, and Vespera looked down at the shoe with the assessing attention of someone determining whether a service has met the standard they set in their own mind before requesting it. She said it was adequate. Not acceptable, not fine. Adequate with the particular inflection of someone for whom adequate represents a concession rather than a conclusion. Then she said something else. She said it quietly, and with the deliberate calm of a woman who understands that volume is for people who are uncertain about their power, and that she had never been uncertain about hers. She said that she knew the building manager personally, and had his private number in her phone, and that she intended to use it before the morning, to ensure that the cleaning staff on this floor was reviewed for professional standards, because what she had just experienced was not the level of service this building was known for, and she did not intend to encounter it again. Sariel's cloth stopped moving. Not visibly. The motion continued, her hands kept their rhythm, but something beneath the motion went completely still in the way that still things go still when they have reached the outermost edge of what they can absorb without fracturing. She thought about the building manager. She thought about his name on her employment paperwork, and the clause in her contract about guest complaints, and the 3 weeks of pay she currently had saved, and what 3 weeks looked like against Eli's monthly medication cost. She thought about all of it in the span of 4 seconds, while her hands kept moving and her face stayed blank, and the corridor hummed with its expensive and indifferent silence. Vespera picked up her bag from the floor where it had fallen during the spill. She checked its contents with the systematic attention of someone inventorying for damage and finding none, but looking anyway because looking was its own form of prolonging the situation. She straightened. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at Sariel one final time with the expression of someone who has said what needed to be said and considers the matter both resolved and beneath further investment. She turned toward the east wing entrance. She had taken exactly 3 steps when the private elevator opened again. Not with the same energy as before, not with the sharp and unhesitating sound of something announcing itself. It opened the way significant things sometimes open, quietly and without preparation, and the man who stepped out of it filled the corridor with a quality of presence that was entirely different from anything the 40th floor had contained in the preceding 27 minutes. Sariel felt it before she saw it. The air changed. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical shift that could be named or pointed to specifically, but the corridor, which had operated until this moment under the organizing principle of Vespera's authority and the specific gravitational pull of her cruelty, reoriented itself in the space of a single breath around something larger and considerably more dangerous. Vespera stopped walking. Sariel looked up. The man in the corridor was looking directly at her, and not at Vespera at all, which was itself a statement of a kind that required no words and left no room for misinterpretation, and his expression was the most frightening thing Sariel had seen in 7 months of 40th floor nights, not because it was angry, but because it was not. It was completely, utterly, and deliberately calm. The smile did not last long enough to be mistaken for warmth. It arrived and settled into something harder almost immediately. The smile of a woman who has confirmed a suspicion she held before entering the room and finds the confirmation satisfying in the specific way that people find satisfying the things that cost them nothing. Sariel was close enough now to see the detail of it, and she kept her eyes on the shoe and her hands steady, and her face arranged in the particular blankness that she had developed over 7 months as her primary professional tool, the expression that communicated neither submission nor resistance, that gave nothing away and invited nothing further, that was, in its own quiet way, the only armor she currently owned. She cleaned the shoe. It took less than 40 seconds. The mark was superficial, and the cloth she was using was the correct one for the material, and she worked with the efficient precision of someone whose hands know what they are doing even when the rest of her is occupied with something else entirely. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and returned to the spill on the floor, and Vespera looked down at the shoe with the assessing attention of someone determining whether a service has met the standard they set in their own mind before requesting it. She said it was adequate. Not acceptable, not fine. Adequate with the particular inflection of someone for whom adequate represents a concession rather than a conclusion. Then she said something else. She said it quietly, and with the deliberate calm of a woman who understands that volume is for people who are uncertain about their power, and that she had never been uncertain about hers. She said that she knew the building manager personally, and had his private number in her phone, and that she intended to use it before the morning, to ensure that the cleaning staff on this floor was reviewed for professional standards, because what she had just experienced was not the level of service this building was known for, and she did not intend to encounter it again. Sariel's cloth stopped moving. Not visibly. The motion continued, her hands kept their rhythm, but something beneath the motion went completely still in the way that still things go still when they have reached the outermost edge of what they can absorb without fracturing. She thought about the building manager. She thought about his name on her employment paperwork, and the clause in her contract about guest complaints, and the 3 weeks of pay she currently had saved, and what 3 weeks looked like against Eli's monthly medication cost. She thought about all of it in the span of 4 seconds, while her hands kept moving and her face stayed blank, and the corridor hummed with its expensive and indifferent silence. Vespera picked up her bag from the floor where it had fallen during the spill. She checked its contents with the systematic attention of someone inventorying for damage and finding none, but looking anyway because looking was its own form of prolonging the situation. She straightened. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at Sariel one final time with the expression of someone who has said what needed to be said and considers the matter both resolved and beneath further investment. She turned toward the East Wing entrance. She had taken exactly 3 steps when the private elevator opened again. Not with the same energy as before, not with the sharp and unhesitating sound of something announcing itself. It opened the way significant things sometimes open, quietly and without preparation, and the man who stepped out of it filled the corridor with a quality of presence that was entirely different from anything the 40th floor had contained in the preceding 27 minutes. Sariel felt it before she saw it. The air changed. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical shift that could be named or pointed to specifically, but the corridor, which had operated until this moment under the organizing principle of Vespera's authority and the specific gravitational pull of her cruelty, reoriented itself in the space of a single breath around something larger and considerably more dangerous. Vespera stopped walking. Sariel looked up. The man in the corridor was looking directly at her, and not at Vespera at all, which was itself a statement of a kind that required no words and left no room for misinterpretation, and his expression was the most frightening thing Sariel had seen in 7 months of 40th floor nights, not because it was angry, but because it was not. It was completely, utterly, and deliberately calm. Malachi let the silence do its work before he spoke again. He had learned a long time ago that silence was the most underestimated instrument available to a man in a confrontation, that most people, when faced with it, rushed to fill it with something that revealed more than they intended to reveal, and that the quality of what they chose to fill it with told you everything you needed to know about what they were actually afraid of. He had used this knowledge in rooms far more dangerous than this corridor, and against people far more formidable than the woman currently maintaining a smile through visible effort 3 feet away from him. He waited. Vespera filled it. She said that there had simply been a misunderstanding, that the cleaning staff had left equipment in an inconvenient position, and that she had merely been addressing it, that she was certain Malachi understood how these things happened in buildings like this one, and that no real harm had been done, and she hoped they could all move forward from the moment without any further disruption to what had already been a very long evening for her personally. Malachi listened to all of it. Then he told her, in the same quiet and undecorated voice he had used since stepping out of the elevator, that he owned the building. He said it without emphasis or performance, the way you state something that has always been true and requires no decoration to remain true. He said it while looking at Vespera with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has finished listening and has moved on to the next part. Vespera's smile developed a second fracture. He continued. He told her that the woman currently on her knees on his marble floor had been an employee of his building for 7 months and had in that time not generated a single incident report, not arrived late once, and not given anyone on his staff a reason to question her presence or her conduct. He said this with the measured precision of someone who has reviewed a file and retained its contents and is now using them with purpose. He said he could not say the same for every person who had passed through his building. He did not look away from Vespera when he said it. Vespera said his name again, softer this time, with the register of a woman attempting to locate a more intimate frequency that might produce a more favorable response. Malachi did not respond to the frequency. He told her there was something else. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a single folded document with the unhurried ease of a man who has known since, before he stepped out of the elevator, that this moment was coming, and has had the document ready for considerably longer than tonight. He held it between 2 fingers and extended it toward her without closing the distance between them, requiring her to come to it rather than bringing it to her. She took it. She unfolded it. The corridor was completely silent while she read. Sariel had not moved from her position on the floor, not because she lacked the agency to stand, but because standing felt, in the architecture of this specific moment, like a disruption to something that was unfolding with its own internal logic and its own appropriate pace. And she had learned enough in 7 months to recognize when a situation was proceeding correctly without her intervention. Vespera's eyes moved across the document once. Then they stopped moving. The document was a debt notice. Specifically, it was a formalized call on the outstanding balance of a private loan issued 14 months ago to a hospitality company registered under her father's name, a company that had been quietly failing for 3 of the 4 years it had been operational, and that had borrowed against assets it no longer held at a valuation that the current market would find optimistic by a considerable margin. The balance was significant. The repayment window indicated on the document had closed 11 days ago. Vespera lowered the paper slowly. She looked at Malachi with an expression that had shed every layer of its constructed warmth, and was now simply the expression underneath, unguarded and recalibrating and stripped of the performance that the performance had always been protecting. Malachi looked back at her with the patient and absolute stillness of a man who has been holding this card for 14 months and has chosen tonight, on this corridor, in front of this woman on her knees, to play it. He told Vespera she had until Friday. Vespera left the way powerful people leave rooms where they have lost. Not with noise, not with the dramatic exit of someone who has decided that volume can substitute for dignity in a moment where dignity has become unavailable. She left with the compressed and effortful composure of a woman who understands that the only remaining currency she possesses in this corridor is the appearance of control, and who is spending every last reserve of it on the 30 feet between where she is standing and the elevator doors. She folded the document. She placed it in her bag with the deliberate and careful movements of someone who needs their hands to have something to do while the rest of them reassembles. She straightened her dress. She picked up the strap of her bag and settled it on her shoulder with the muscle memory of a gesture performed 10,000 times before tonight, a gesture so habitual that her body produced it correctly even while the person inside it was doing something considerably less composed. She did not look at Sariel. That was the most telling thing. She had spent the better part of the last 30 minutes looking at Sariel with the full and focused attention of her contempt, and now she could not locate the angle from which looking at her was possible. Something had shifted in the geometry of the corridor that made the direction of Sariel's position unavailable to her, and she moved toward the elevator without finding it. Malachi watched her go without moving. He stood with his hands at his sides and his expression unchanged, and he gave her the corridor and the 30 feet and the elevator without comment or theater, because he was not a man who needed the last word in situations where the last word had already been spoken by the document she was carrying in her bag. The elevator arrived. Vespera stepped inside. The doors closed. The corridor absorbed her absence the way expensive spaces absorb disruption, completely and without residue, returning almost immediately to the particular quality of stillness that had existed before she arrived, as though the air itself had a preference for the version of the room that did not contain her. Malachi turned. Sariel was still on the floor. Not because she had forgotten to stand, not because she lacked the capacity, but because the sequence of the last 40 minutes had produced in her a specific kind of stillness that her body had not yet received instruction to exit. She was looking at the space where Vespera had been standing with the expression of a woman, processing the distance between what she had prepared herself to absorb tonight and what had actually occurred. Malachi crouched down, not all the way to the floor, enough to reduce the distance between his eye level and hers in a way that was deliberate without being theatrical, that communicated something without announcing what it was communicating. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at her with the same directness he had used since stepping out of the elevator, the same quality of attention that asked nothing of her presentation and required nothing from her performance. He asked her name. Sariel told him. He said it once, quietly, the way you say a name when you are filing it somewhere permanent rather than using it as a social courtesy you will release as soon as the conversation ends. Then he told her something that caused the stillness in her chest to shift in a way she had not anticipated and was not immediately equipped to process. He told her he knew about Eli. He said it gently and without elaboration, leaving space around the words for her to occupy however she needed to. He did not explain how. He did not produce documentation or context or any of the surrounding architecture that the statement required and that she would eventually need. He simply said it and let it exist between them in the quiet corridor while the building hummed around them, and the coffee on the marble had long since stopped spreading. Sariel looked at him. The question she could not yet form sat in her expression, with the particular clarity of things that are too large for immediate language. Malachi stood. He told her to finish her shift. He told her that when she was done, someone would be waiting at the East Service exit with an envelope that would explain what she wanted to know. Then he walked toward the East Wing without looking back, his footsteps unhurried and even on the marble, the footsteps of a man who has done what he came to do and is at peace with the doing of it. Sariel watched him go. Then she looked down at her cloth, still in her hand. She finished the coffee stain with 3 steady strokes. The East Service exit smelled like the city. Not the 40th floor version of the city, which was filtered and expensive and arrived in the building pre-approved, but the actual city. Cold and immediate and indifferent, the version that Sariel had been navigating every night for 7 months with her collar turned up and her transit card in her left pocket, and the particular alertness of a woman who moves through the early morning hours alone and has made her peace with what that requires. She pushed through the door at 4:51. A man she did not recognize was standing 6 feet from the exit with a plain envelope in his hand and the specific quality of stillness that she had come to associate, in the past 2 hours, with people who worked for Malachi Thorne. He extended the envelope without speaking. She took it without speaking. He walked away in the direction of the parking structure and did not look back, and that was the entirety of the interaction. She held the envelope for a moment without opening it. The street was quiet at this hour. A delivery truck moved through the intersection at the end of the block. A light changed from red to green for no one in particular. Sariel stood outside the building she had cleaned for 7 months and felt, for the first time since she could accurately remember, that the ground beneath her had a different quality than it had possessed the last time she had stood still enough to check. She opened the envelope. There were 2 documents inside. The first was a letter on unmarked paper in a clean and direct handwriting that wasted nothing and said everything it needed to say in 11 lines. It told her that her brother Eli's medical expenses for the preceding 14 months had been covered through a private arrangement that required nothing from her and would continue for as long as necessary. It told her that her tuition for the degree she had suspended 3 years ago to take the night shift had been paid in full at the university's bursar office as of the previous Thursday. It told her that a meeting had been arranged for 9 o'clock Monday morning at an address on the second line if she chose to attend, and that the choice was entirely hers. The second document was a formal offer of employment. Not as a cleaning contractor, as a building operations director for the Thorn Group's residential and commercial properties division, a position whose listed salary caused Sariel to read the number twice, and then a third time with her finger under it to ensure she was reading the correct line. She stood on the pavement outside the building with both documents in her hands, and the city moving quietly around her, and the early morning cold doing what early morning cold does, clarifying everything it touches, stripping away the residue of the hours just past, and leaving only what remains when everything unnecessary has been removed. What remained was this. Eli was safe. Her debt was gone, and a man she had not known existed before 2:41 this morning had watched her be diminished in a corridor, and had responded not with pity, but with the specific and actionable recognition of someone who understands what a person is actually worth, and finds the distance between that worth, and how they are being treated to be a problem requiring immediate correction. She folded both documents and placed them in her coat pocket. She picked up her bag. She looked up at the building one final time, all 40 floors of it rising into the pre-dawn gray of the city sky, and she looked at it differently than she had looked at it every other morning she had walked out of it, not as a place she was leaving, but as a place she was choosing what to do with, which was an entirely different relationship to have with a building, and one that fit considerably better than the previous one. She turned and walked toward the bus stop. Her posture was the same as it had been when she left the courthouse 7 months ago, spine straight, chin level, the carriage of a woman who has decided that the last image any space will carry of her will not be a collapsed one. But something underneath the posture was different now. Not louder, not harder, simply more settled, the way a thing settles when it has finally been placed on the surface it was always meant to rest on. The bus came at 5:04. Sariel got on. She did not look back at the building. She was already thinking about Monday.